says, "But the whole assembly talked of stoning them." Likely would have happened had the next verse not read, "Then the glory of the Lord appeared." We know this story. We love this story. And we know that the Lord punished the Israelites with 40 years of wandering. We know that due to their unbelief, all of those 20 years old and older that had come out of Egypt died in that wilderness. But that God looks favorably upon both Joshua and Caleb. We know Joshua becomes Moses' assistant and the next great leader of God's people. In many ways, he is the type of the Yehoshua to come. But do we know the rest of the story of Caleb? I'd like to pick up this morning in the book of Joshua. You need to have your Bibles, and you need to be looking at Joshua chapter 13 right now. We're going to spend most of our time in Joshua 14. I want to look at Joshua chapter 13. Joshua 13, verse 1. And it says, "When Joshua was old and well advanced in years, the Lord said to him, 'You are very old, and there are still very large areas of land to be taken over.'" Man, when God tells you you're old, you're old. God is not a man that he should lie. So if he says you're old, it is so. And we don't know how much younger or older Joshua is than Caleb. There are some thoughts. But if they are roughly the same age, then Caleb is old. How old was Caleb when he spied on Canaan? Do you remember? How old was he when he was crawling around doing the army crawl through Canaan and coming back with a pole of grapes? He was 40 when he entered Canaan the first time. God would say to Caleb, "You're old." But back here in verse 1, it says, God tells Joshua, "You're old, but," what? "You still got work to do." And he gives him the job of dividing the land amongst the tribes, clan by clan by clan, according to all the Lord had shown Moses. And this work is going to continue for the next 9 chapters. I'm sure it wasn't at all like this, but all I can picture in my mind's eye is a huge Hebraic Ellis Island, right? They were walking up with their papers to the official. Reuben, to the south. Asher, that way. Separating them clan by clan and tribe by tribe. And this goes on. How many chapters did I say? 9 chapters. But there's this parenthesis. There is this parenthesis in the midst of all of this, and it's chapter 14. Turn to chapter 14, verse 6. Now the men of Judah approached Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, said to him, "You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, at Kadesh Barnea about you and me." Well, maybe Joshua knows, but I don't know. What was it that God had said back then? That's recorded in Numbers. Back in Numbers 14, and this is God speak, and he's saying, "No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it." What's he referring to? The promised land. God says, anyone who's ever treated me with contempt is not going to see it, but because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. And that's what Caleb is referring to now. Again, now the men of Judah approached Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, said to him, "You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, at Kadesh Barnea, about you and me. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land. And I brought him back a report." See what it says there? I brought him back a report according to my convictions. Yeah. But my brothers who went up with me made the hearts of people melt with fear. I, however, followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. This notion of being wholehearted is repeated about Caleb 4 or 5 times. So Caleb, the representative of the tribe of Judah, reminds Joshua that he'd made a report according to his convictions, to what he felt in his heart, not necessarily based on the facts on the ground. Were the fortifications strong? Yes, they were. Were the giants in the land? You bet. Were there a lot of them? Also true. But Caleb gave his report according to his heart. And that goes beyond the facts of the matter. Caleb spoke according to his heart, enjoining the people that the land was theirs. But the reports of the others had the effect of melting people's hearts. It's all about your heart. And Caleb followed the Lord wholeheartedly. So when it says Caleb was wholehearted for the Father, when it repeats that time and again, what does it mean? In the original language, the closest we can really come to is close the gap. That's about the closest translation we get to wholehearted. If we were hunting, it would be to achieve the minimum distance to your target. Except that God is not prey, and he doesn't run from us. Closing the gap is about having God here. Samuel Jackson asks, "What's in your wallet?" Caleb would ask, "Who's in your heart?" So on that day, Moses swore to me, "The land on which you walked will be your inheritance, and that of your children forever, because you followed the Lord my God wholeheartedly. Now then, just as the Lord promised, he has kept me alive for 45 years since the time he said this to Moses while Israel moved about the desert. So here I am today." What's it say there? 85 years old. You see? Caleb knows what's to be his. He knows that the promise is true, that what God had said decades back still holds, and that which was once a promise will soon be a possession. And that God himself has kept him alive, has kept me alive, it says, to see it. You know what this tells me? You know, we sometimes speak of God calling people to sleep before the time of trouble. That in his mercy they're spared living through those difficulties. That's true. I bet that's going to happen. But this verse tells us that some will be kept alive to see that great day. We have the example of Simeon. waiting at the temple until he saw the infant Redeemer. And he said it had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Christ. And once he held him in his arms on that great day, he says, "You now dismiss your servant in peace." I am convicted there will be some alive at the time of Jesus' second coming that we wouldn't expect to hold out that long. But God will have kept them alive, just as he did Caleb for 45 years. What'd Caleb do for 40 some odd years in the wilderness? He spent all that time saying, "Are we there yet?" No, I'd offer that Caleb did two things during those long years in the desert. First, he watched the signs. He knew the promise that he would leave that place, and he knew the punishment that most would not. And he saw those people dying around him every day. He knew the signs, and he knew it was just getting closer. He saw his entire generation die. He saw lots of people younger than him die. Is it any different for us? Do we have a destination? Do we know where it is? Yes. Do we know when it is? Yes. At the midnight cry. Could we spend all our time saying, "Are we there yet?" Don't do that. Instead, watch the signs. Be mindful. Caleb was mindful that way. Second, I bet Caleb told his story. The story of the beauty and the promise of Canaan. He encouraged the young people. Can you hear him? I know that you were born into this mess. That this wilderness is all you've ever known. But let me tell you, I've seen the place where we're going. And it's a goodly land. The promise is true, Caleb would tell them. God is taking us there, and he is faithful. I bet Caleb told his story a lot. But in 4 decades of telling the story, don't you think that perhaps there were days when he despaired? Maybe nobody wants to hear this anymore. Maybe I sound like a broken record. I bet that happened too. Corrie ten Boom had a story. We know Corrie ten Boom. You remember it well, hiding Jews behind a false wall in her bedroom, being sent to the concentration camps, losing her sister, her father. Corrie ten Boom traveled the world telling the story of the hiding place. And she too, a woman of indomitable strength, Corrie ten Boom grew weary. Maybe people are tired of hearing the same story of life and trials and death in the Netherlands. She got tired. She wondered if it mattered anymore, if others were weary of it. And so she took her misgivings in prayer to the Lord and told him perhaps it was stale. Corrie prayed to God, "Lord, I must have something fresh. I cannot go on telling the old story." And as she reports it, the Lord said to me, "This is the story I gave you. You tell that one. For 40 years, Caleb told his story. Verse 11, back in 14. I am still as strong as the day Moses sent me out. I am just as vigorous to go out to battle now as I was then. Now give me this mountain that the Lord promised me that day. Caleb is proclaiming, this mountain was promised to me by God. I am going up to the mountain of the Lord. Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord. Verse 12. You yourself heard then that the Anakites were there, and their cities were large and fortified, but the Lord helping me, I will drive them out, just as he said. Caleb is saying, and I'm willing to fight for it. I meant it back then that we could take these guys, and I mean it now. Doesn't matter to me that there are giants in the land, that the Anakites strike fear and cause hearts to melt. Doesn't matter, because the Lord helping me, I will drive them out just as he said. For Caleb, this is done already. God has spoken it, so it is so. Faith is not hope. Faith is not hope. Faith is expectancy. A pregnant woman is not faithful, she's expecting. It's going to happen. Faith is not optimism. Faith is not looking on the bright side. Faith is simply acting on what God says. On what God has already said. Caleb is wholehearted for God and is ready to act on his word. I will drive them out, just as he said. I think Caleb would have liked casting crowns. Their song, You're Already There, speaks to this idea that what God has willed is already so. The line says, to you, my future is a memory, 'cause you're already there. God has willed this mountain to Caleb, and Caleb knows it is done. It's what theologians call the prophetic perfect tense, speaking of future events as if they are already accomplished. No obstacle can keep the promise from being fulfilled because God is already there. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons nor giants, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of Christ. Separate us from Mount Zion. Separate you from the mountain of the Lord, because he's already there. Continuing with verse 13. Then Joshua blessed Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and gave him Hebron as his inheritance. Can't you just picture Joshua here? Oh, yes. You go, Caleb. Anak has no idea the hurricane that's about to hit him. You go. Jump over to chapter 15. Chapter 15, verse 13. In accordance with the Lord's command to him, Joshua gave to Caleb, son of Jephunneh, a portion in Judah, Kiriath Arba, that is, Hebron. And from Hebron, Caleb drove out the three Anakites, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, descendants of Anak. Caleb, at 85 years young, drives out the sons of Anak, chases them out of the city, out of the surrounding foothills, all the way out. When Caleb is done, you won't find a giant till Gath. But back in chapter 14, verse 14. So Hebron has belonged to Caleb, son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, ever since, because he followed the Lord, the God of Israel, wholeheartedly. What a lovely verse this is. Hebron has belonged to Caleb ever since. The promise has become a possession. And why? Because he followed the Lord with all his heart. Hebron is now Caleb's city. Is that not just what we learned? Family, this is astonishing. I am astonished that Caleb would lay claim to this city. Because you know, Hebron wasn't just any city. Hebron was the city of none less than the patriarch of the patriarchs. Hebron was Abraham's city. The cave of Machpelah is in Hebron. Sarah is buried there. Abraham is buried there. Isaac is buried there. Rebekah is buried there. Jacob, Israel himself, is buried there. Leah is buried there. Caleb is identifying himself with the patriarchs. He is saying, I am of Abraham. But it's more than that. Caleb is reaching back, past Jacob, past Isaac, past Abraham, to Jehovah himself, to the God that told Abram, leave your country, leave your people, and go to the land I will show thee. God had shown Hebron first to Abraham, and now to Caleb. Caleb's claim on Hebron is astounding. It is bold beyond audacious. If Barack Obama has the audacity of hope, Caleb here is showing the audacity of faith. It is more than audacious. It is astonishing. Claiming Hebron? Who are you anyway? And he simply tells us what he's been saying all along. I am Caleb, the Kenizzite. Now do you see it? What makes this claim on Hebron so amazing is that Caleb, the representative of the tribe of Judah, isn't even an Israelite. He is Caleb the Kenizzite, Caleb the Gentile, Caleb the Goy. Let that sink in a minute. Do you recognize the significance here? It means that the first two men to see the promised land and believe it was theirs in the Lord were a Jew and a Gentile. Paul says in the epistles, I am not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew and then for the Gentile. But this idea of salvation for the Gentiles doesn't begin in Romans. God is showing us here, all the way back, in the story of Caleb the Kenizzite, who was shown the promised land and given the city of Abraham as his own. That's who Caleb is. And that's part of the story that he was telling all those years in the wilderness. He would tell all that would listen that it didn't matter where you come from. Didn't matter who your parents were. Doesn't matter what circumstances you endured. Doesn't matter that you grew up in Egypt surrounded by idolatry and immorality. Doesn't matter if you grew up in America surrounded by secularism and materialism. You can choose God. Caleb had a heart for God. And if you are likewise wholehearted for the Lord, then you can rightly and confidently proclaim, give me this mountain. If you are ready to have that kind of love for the Father, if you are understanding that it doesn't matter who you are or where you came from, if you are ready to be wholehearted for God, I'm going to ask that we stand up. I'm going to ask, and we say, proclaim, give me this mountain. We sang this morning, till from Mount Pisgah's lofty height, I view my home and take my flight. The robe of flesh I'll drop and rise to seize the everlasting prize. Do you understand that the promise will soon be our possession? Then let's be wholehearted for God. Amen. Oh, I gotta do the benediction yet. Father, you have quickened us this morning. You have taught us about yourself. Father, that we would love you all the more. We ask, Father, that you would go with us, that your Spirit would go before us, that we might see the paths that you are guiding us through, that we would be aware of the signs before us, and that you would cause us to be wholehearted for the things of heaven. That's our prayer. Amen.
Amen.